Hi there, welcome to Making of. This is going to be a little series that I'm going to be doing from time to time where I go through my personal professional processes as a concept artist and explain how I kind of like make the imagery that I make and put out into the world. Hopefully in the process demystifying some of the processes that I and other professionals use, and also giving you an insight into how I like to think through projects. My name is Daniel McGarry. I'm a concept artist. I've been working in the industry for 5 years. And as a concept artist, as I'm sure many of you listening know, one of the things that we have to constantly do is produce personal work. And I have made a massive amount of personal projects over the last 4 years. So really, this whole kind of like, doing these YouTube videos, and hopefully I'll do more than one. The goal is to just show all of this artwork and how I actually went about making it. Because I think, especially when you're a student or even when you're a young professional, it can be really confusing, doing your own personal projects and trying to figure out the best way to go about it. So this is my most recent personal project. I decided to start off with this one because it's very fresh in my mind. And this is called Zakar. So this is just a series of like 4 images that I produced, all in the same kind of like world building. I suppose you could say it's quite keyframe heavy, so to speak. There's not a lot of like call outs or design sketches. But not every project needs to be that, and I'll definitely cover some projects where I do more sketching in the future. This project started off with this little doodle. So I like to start all of my projects with kind of like a very loose idea in mind. Sometimes I do have like a very, very clear idea, but since I'm a freelancer, I need to produce quite a lot of concept art, and I need to produce quite a lot of personal work to put up online so that people kind of remember who I am. And, if they're looking for somebody they need somebody for a project, that they can come and hire me and they go like, oh, I've seen that guy's work, whatever. So sometimes when I'm stuck for ideas, this is pretty much where I start, with just a little bit of a doodle on my iPad. So my initial idea with this whole project was I wanted to do a bit of like a sci-fi western town. Something kind of cowboy-ish, and you will definitely see that this project went in a very different direction by the end. But this is where it began. So just a really loose sketch, kind of like almost orthographic, getting in some colors, giving some insinuation of texture. It's a very, very rough sketch, but it's something that helps me think through my processes and kind of get going. So after doing that, I actually made this image. So this is a rough kind of like 3D render of that sketch. And really the idea here was just to figure out like, what kind of world is this going to inhabit? Because the way that you present, different like designs that you produce massively changes the context and the feeling and the way the audience perceives what you do. So, I mean, spoiler here, but all of this stuff ends up in the desert with sandstorms around it. But starting off here, you can see that like the same design looks so dramatically different in 2 different scenarios, right? And this kind of more grassy, pleasant kind of landscape was where I began, because I was thinking about these red roofs as almost being like corrugated farmhouse roofs or something. But anyway, I kind of moved away from that pretty quickly. As you can see, there's a few tiny edits there just to like clean up some edges. But this is eventually where I started to move towards this much more kind of desolate landscape. Partially because I realized I didn't really have a lot of work like this in my portfolio. I don't really have many desert projects in my portfolio. And I do actually have quite a lot of projects with grass in them. That might sound like a very granular point of difference, but you're always trying to create some level of variation in what you're producing, even on the macro scale of the different types of projects you're producing. So I thought, maybe I'll do something a bit different and put it in a different environment. Now this sketch, if you are familiar with the project that I've put on ArtStation, you'll know that this isn't in there. And that's because I started developing a lot of these pieces at the same time. And as I was developing this project, I also started developing this image. Now, initially, this image and this image were meant to be in the same world, but very, very quickly, I kind of started designing this more, pushing it, pushing the architecture and the influences I was looking at. And I kind of started to realize that I didn't really think that this design here, this initial kind of sketch that I did, fit in the same world that this design did. So with that in mind, I could, and maybe in the future I could take this design and I could, change it a lot, or I could change the landscape it's in, or I could just use it for a different project. But for this project, I kind of pushed away from it, and I kind of got rid of it from the project essentially, because I felt it wasn't worth putting in the time to change this when this image was already starting to look a lot more appealing by the time I'd done this. So let's start talking about this project, because I think there's actually, you know, this section of the project at least, because there's a lot more to talk about here. So this is where I started with this. Let's take a drink of water, sorry. Oh, actually, this is where I started. So this is how I start off a lot of my like large scale architectural explorations. So I do actually also have a sketch of this building somewhere, although really the only thing that that sketch captures is this kind of like big halo shape above the roof. But this is how I start a lot of them. So when I'm designing like a cityscape or something, I'll create like a little note layer here, maybe. When I'm designing something like this, I'm really trying to think about placing and grouping areas into appealing like sections. So almost like big, medium, small. But what I like to think about is increasing density towards certain areas. So where I want you to look, which is going to be this big block here, whatever the final design of this big block is going to be, this is going to be the most dense area of the design, right? So it's going to be the most visually dense. Maybe it's the most physically dense because it's like a larger building. Maybe it has the most material variety. Maybe it has the most detail density, whatever it may be. And I will often arrange the rest of the elements so that they increase in density towards that main object. So you can see over here, pick a slightly better color than orange here. Let's do turquoise. So you can see over here, this whole area is very empty, right? As is this area here. But what we're what I'm trying to do is increase the amount of density as we go forward so that the viewer's eye gets drawn in towards the city and towards our main focal point. If we had loads and loads of buildings, and I'll just do this with some white blocks here. If we have loads of buildings here and here and here and here, right? And we have lots of density, it actually starts to make it harder to focus on this main building, specifically because there's so much other stuff to focus on in the design, right? It's that classic thing of, just to draw a little diagram over here. If you have a big white space, right, and then you put one orange dot in the middle, you can focus on the orange dot. If you put, a ginormous orange dot over here, and then another big orange shape over here, it's harder to focus on it. In fact, you might focus on the area in between, right? So I'm always trying to think about kind of like different densities and the contrast between them. The reason that I want this empty area, the reason I want the detail density to gradate towards this main building is not only because that will naturally lead the eye there, but also because it creates contrast to lead the eye to that area, right? So we're trying to have almost like, it's not exactly like this, but you can imagine kind of like areas of like a lot of detail, some detail, and very little detail over here. So as we're going, we're getting more and more dense. So that's kind of like my very vague thought process about this. The other thing, and you'll see this more as I start to build this up, is I'm trying to think about kind of asymmetry. So one thing, that can kind of look either very good or very bad is symmetry. I try and avoid it myself as much as I can sometimes. That's why you'll see on a lot of my architectural designs, even though I might have symmetrical elements like this and this, I'll counterbalance them by having an asymmetrical element on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. And that's because asymmetry generally, I think, looks a lot more interesting. So over on the right-hand side, I have all these pipes and stuff. So maybe this is like a water treatment plant or a pumping station or something. And then over here on the left, we have a lot more buildings. And maybe here on the left, we have more of these like tarps hanging down and blah, 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 whatever. So I'm trying to figure out, how to create like an interesting rest of the area, as well as producing, kind of like, the wall shape itself is already super asymmetrical, and that really helps as well because, I can't fit exactly the same building over here that I can fit over here on the right to the left. So just having like innate asymmetry in whatever you've designed is super helpful too. When it comes to the main building, I've obviously started to model this, and this doesn't look drastically different to what the kind of like final-ish building design looks like. Generally, when I was doing this, I was just looking at a lot of brutalist stuff. These things at the back, are based on, I think they're called like Iranian wind tunnels or something. They're essentially like filtration systems that like cool the air in a building. So what happens is you have like hot air, I don't know, something like the hot air goes in, and because it moves down, it gets cold. I have no idea how it works. All I know is that it's a thing in real life. And I knew that, you know, if this is meant to be like this harsh, arid desert environment, maybe that's exactly the kind of thing I should include. It's the same thing with including these tarps, right? If you're in a very, very hot environment, you want to have a lot of overhead coverings to increase the amount of shadow around you, because that's going to help you stay cool. In the same way, with this building design here, one thing that I generally really like to do is I like to have gardens on my building design. So if you look at a lot of my architectural stuff, you'll see gardens and kind of like trees and stuff on the buildings. But I couldn't do this on this one because this is like, again, it's meant to be very, very hot, harsh, arid environment. So it doesn't really make sense. So I'm trying to, you know, look for things that fit within the environment and the world building that I'm trying to do, whilst also providing like some nice visual details across it. This is the next stage of it. You can see that I have moved into, you know, modeling a lot of the city down here, and we've got a bunch of photo bash and 3D in the background and around here for the environment. So just to save myself here, this is not, you know, this is obviously not final photo bash or 3D. This is something that I do when I'm trying to test out ideas. On a professional project, you don't really have to do this, right? Because someone will literally say to you, hey, this is the brief, this is what you're going to do. But I often find when I'm doing personal work, I'm trying to look for like the best possible solution, you know, that I can think of, that I think really fits the idea. And so I started off with, you know, this very kind of like large plains. I kind of think of like, I don't know, Arizona or something, the deserts in Arizona, these like super wide plains, which give the building a lot of breathing room. But I think, and you'll see that I changed this, but ultimately kind of didn't look that great because there wasn't any contrast in this environment with the rest of the building. Something you always have to consider, the same as when we're doing, you know, this stuff to this stuff, is how are you going to surround your design, right? You can't design every single thing in the world that you're going to be building as a concept artist. But you want to at least make sure that the stuff that you're not designing, in this case the landscape, right, because it's just a normal desert, is going to be fitting within the world of this, like, you know, cityscape that you have designed. And so that's when we shifted to this much nicer mountain. So the great thing about including an element like this into your 3D scene, or really into any concept art scene essentially, is it gives us a few really big advantages. Number one, it gives us a realistic reason to cast a shadow across the city. When you have a really big scale kind of like location like this, where maybe, you know, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 people could theoretically live in a place like this, right? Because it's big enough for that. You're going to get like larger shadows that might be cast by clouds or, you know, mountains or whatever else is in the surrounding area. And as you can see here, like one of the problems here is I tried to put a shadow at the back of this building, but it just doesn't feel very believable, because even if I had placed a shadow across the ground, it would feel quite contrived, right? So I'm trying to draw attention away from here and over to here, but it doesn't feel like there's a good excuse to do that. So adding in the mountain makes it feel like there is a believable reason to have a shadow in the background. Similarly, it also, you know, we've got this really highly reflective gold element where I want you to be looking, but on this other background, right, it's going to be bright because it's kind of like this large open landscape. So again, by sticking this mountain in here, we now have an excuse to, you know, have a lot more value contrast in that area, which makes it way, way, way easier to look at and much more appealing. Before we jump into the next stuff, which I think will be like these things here and these changes, I thought it'd be useful to actually see some of the 3D scene. So I'm not going to go into cycles or render mode, because I'm worried that my computer will crash while it's, you know, also using OBS and has like 5 Photoshop files open. But this is roughly what my scene looks like. So you can see I'm actually using some clouds up here. So these clouds are like shadow catchers. So they're casting shadows onto the environment below, to kind of give like a nice natural like shadow breakup on the location. Obviously I've moved them around so that they are creating shadows exactly where I want them to be, but it's a nice way to make things look a little bit more natural. And you can also see really what I think is the most important thing to show, how this scene is built. Because when we look over here, this thing is a nightmare. You can see that I've even used like a few bits of like some Sketchfab or Google Maps data scans over here to try and add in some like almost kitbashy details just in the background here and there. You'll also see that like all of these buildings are almost exactly the same building, just with slightly different textures and stuff. It's a real big mess, you know, especially if you look over here, there's just nothing going on. So this is something that I do on like 99% of my projects. And this is called kind of like buildings camera is what people refer to it as. So when we look through it at camera, you know, lens, like position or whatever you want to call it, everything looks together, right? So any weird stuff is being hidden by the wall. Like this wall is a great example, right? If we look over this wall, there's very little there. There's nothing behind that wall, right? It's all just empty space. But when we're back in the main position, if it lets me undo it, there we go. When we're back in that main position, all of that stuff is hidden. So there's no need to build all of these things, you know, behind the wall, because really all that's doing is it's going to just eat up a bunch of memory on my computer when I'm trying to render this and build out this scene. Essentially, I'm just trying to be as efficient as possible with building all of this, even when it comes to, you know, like looking at the other side of this building. Like, okay, it has roughly the same proportions, but it has none of the same detailing that I've done on the other side, because it's unnecessary to put details there because I can't see it. Now, this is obviously, again, it's worth saying, a personal project, right? If I was doing this for a professional client, maybe I would have to design the other side of it, because, you know, they want a turnaround of the building or they want to see it from every angle, whatever. But within the context of what I'm doing here, the reason I'm doing this is just to keep everything as efficient as possible. It's the same reason I have all of these like similar looking little houses here, and it's because if we move one of them towards camera very slowly, here we go, they're pretty low res. You can see, I mean, maybe it's a little bit higher res than it should be, but it's not a super complicated piece of geometry. I haven't put in loads of windows or details. There are no heavy textures on there. It's just like a little basic building, because at this scale, it doesn't matter if it's a small basic building or not. It's just going to read as like a rooftop with maybe some gaps in between, essentially. The only other thing that's really worth pointing out on here is just that this guy did survive a little bit. So I actually use this building, as I said, because, you know, it's just rooftops and stuff. This building is dotted across the kind of scene a little bit. So we've got one over here, we've got one over here. And again, you know, in the larger context of the scene, it's largely unnoticeable, but it adds a nice bit of difference across this kind of image. Let's go back to Photoshop. So yeah, this is the kind of render that I was getting out of that scene. So I do have a few things going on here which are different. So you'll see in between, so this is the raw render, I think, and this is my like first step of like changes. You'll see one of the first things I did was I immediately went in and put in some high resolution photo bash into the background here. Photo bashing is not necessarily like the thing I'm best at, but I think it really can add just like a lot of really nice detail, which you can't get otherwise, especially when you're going for a more photoreal look. You'll also see I've started to kind of like grade the image a little bit more and give it a bit more contrast just to help it all out. If we keep on going, more photo bash, add in some photo bash over here, more photo bash over here on the left. And also I've started to, you know, ping out a few little areas here and there. So for example, on this dish thing, whatever it's meant to be, I've started picking out a few little random areas to get like different kind of like highlight pings on it. The reason this is nice is it just gives you, again, kind of like more details, essentially. It's like very free details. With something metallic like this, especially if it's damaged, you can imagine that all of those pieces of metal might be facing ever so slightly different directions. So they're going to be catching slightly different bits of sun, and therefore have different kind of like levels to them, which is a nice thing to have in. What else we got? Okay, this is a much bigger change. So you can see that I've done a few things. So here, for example, if we just look into this one area, you'll see that I'm using essentially like some textures here to really start breaking up this area. So one thing is when you're trying to do like a more, I wouldn't say I'm an expert at doing like super realistic images, but I feel like I can do them to an extent. But one thing that I'm always looking for is trying to add in pretty much as much texture as possible across the whole thing. And this is kind of a thing that I've been doing for a few years to get it in when I'm in a rush is I use this brush here. So I don't know who made this brush originally, but you can get any kind of like large textural brush like this, and all you have to do to get in some free quick texture is pick a middle gray, go into your brush settings up here, go to your color dynamics, and then just turn the brightness jitter all the way up and these two jitters down. And then what you can do is if you have an area, and let's do this on, let's say the raw render down here. If you have an area like this dish or something, right, that needs a little bit more texture in, what you can do is you can go in with this brush and it creates some very, very high frequency noise. So really any brush that creates high frequency noise with the brightness jitter on is good. And then you can set that to overlay and turn it down a little bit. And you kind of have this visible but not too destructive noise, kind of similar to what you would get from a lot of textures that you might actually put into your 3D. So that's one of the things I've done here, and you can see I've probably left it on a little bit too strong in this area, but it is visible here. So that's what that is. That's kind of how I'm getting that effect on top of the other textural effects I've added in. Let's go back to full screen. Oops. What else have we done? I've added some stuff into the atmosphere. You can see there's some dirt and some dust flying around. You can kind of imagine this is maybe like, you know, grains of sand flying past the camera. I think one pretty important thing that's changed here as well is just adding in that white highlight along the rim of the golden halo. This is like, you know, it might seem like a very small thing, but adding in rim lights wherever you can really can help pick out certain areas because they're such high contrast kind of like pings of light. They can really help a lot. And then I think the other thing that's, you know, worth looking at is just more photo bash essentially. So I've like photo bashed in some banners, some doors. I've started putting in, you know, all of this detail on the wall here, which really adds a lot of depth. Wasn't there before. That really helps. I've adjusted that piece of wall that was clearly at the wrong height. And really, you know, what I'm doing as I go through, and you'll see this, and this is the final one where, you know, even smaller adjustments where I'm just painting in like some broken bits of roof and stuff. Really what I'm doing is I'm trying to make choices that like improve the 3D essentially. So I already have a very good piece of 3D, right, which is doing a lot of the work for me right here. There's not a massive amount of change going on between these two things. But what I'm trying to do is I'm accentuating and making choices that help to push the best bits of the 3D, and I'm going in with paint and photo bash work to get rid of the worst bits of the 3D. So, you know, this mountain in the background, which is a pretty cool 3D model, the second we photo bash on top of it, it looks dramatically better, right? And we can still keep bits of the 3D model, like down here, where this kind of like, I don't know, sandy texture looks quite cool. But we don't want to have the bad bits because then that's going to distract. And, you know, again, over here, these areas in the right-hand corner, could I have photo bashed over these? Absolutely. And would it have probably looked better? Yes. But it would have been a very minimal difference because it's far away from the focal point. And I'm hoping that you're going to be looking directly here into the center. So that's pretty much the gist of this one. So from, you know, this to this to this to this to this to this. So yeah. Let's move on to this robot guy. This one's probably a little bit simpler to talk about and has some different kind of like things going on. So this robot dude, my idea was with this guy that he's kind of like down in the gutters down here. So like there's meant to be some depth in this. You can kind of see it in the 3D scene. If we go here, might actually have to close this 3D scene. So I'm kind of imagining he's like down here below somewhere. You know, there's kind of like some underbelly to the city, and that's where he's kind of existing. So if we just go back, there we go. So this started in very much the same way as all of them, with just like a basic 3D block out. With something like this, where I already have a very kind of clear idea of what I want to do, which is I want to do a broken robot that's been destroyed, and you know they're doing something with it. It's quite simple in a way. All you have to really do is design that main focal point, and because it's going to take up so much of the frame, the rest of those elements just need to then support that focal point. So you can see like really the final image is all here, insofar as we have the light source, which is this kind of like piece of light, you know, skylight that's coming up here, which is maybe a break in the sewer or whatever they're in. We've got these pipes which it's resting against, which also kind of create a nice backdrop for it. Not only because they create nice shapes behind the character, and also like nice areas of contrast, because we get these areas of shadow contrasting with the areas of light on the character's head, but also because it's kind of befitting of this kind of like slightly nasty underground environment, right? We've got a character from CGC, good friends, lovely people who make great models. And, you know, then we've just put in these kind of like, I don't know, metallic support elements to not only make it look a little bit more architectural over here, but also to help like guide our eye to the focal point again. This kind of like arcing shape here where we're coming into the camera from the right towards the focal point and then above the focal point here, it kind of creates like quite a nice framing, like almost triangular shape. It's not really, it's more of a very crappy rectangle, but it creates a nice frame because we have this element on the left hand side framing the robot, we've got this element above framing the robot, and we've got this piece on the right hand side framing the robot. So it creates kind of like almost a picture within a picture effect. Let's see what we did here. That's just a pass with a little bit of volume attached to it. This was actually, so this is interesting. So when I'm producing personal work, for me, it's personal stuff. It's not necessarily work time. So sometimes I like to go out of my way to do things I don't usually do. Now, one thing that I don't do that much is like really hardcore photo bashing. And that's because realistically in my career, when I came into the concept art industry, photo bashing is still super essential, but it's not something we do for like every image necessarily. It's a lot more 3D heavy these days, which I think is a shame. Honestly, I would like to have time to practice more photo bashing. But because this was a personal project, I decided, hey, I'll try doing photo bashing. So I took my render of the thing, the robot like this, and I started going on top and working into it. Now, I don't think this was super successful. If we zoom in here, you can see like mainly what I was focusing on was like, okay, I'm going to paint over this arm and I'm going to photo bash into this area and I'm going to change the head shape and I'm going to work on these pipes and stuff. I didn't work on this for a super long time because I kind of realized at some point, I was like, this isn't going to look too great. But it was actually quite useful because, you know, especially with this area here, I was having to use real world references and look at real world references and this area over here as well. And so some of this stuff actually makes its way into the final actual image, which obviously uses a lot more 3D. But again, you know, doing stuff like this, I'm sure some people might look at doing, you know, I don't know, I probably spent like 3 hours doing this maybe, just experimenting for my own personal enjoyment. I think this is a really important thing to do, you know, and I'm kind of happy to show these kind of things which don't go so well, because a lot of the time you just see like these super polished pieces of work on ArtStation or on Instagram, and that's not always the case. Like there's definitely times where I just don't make something good, and in this case that's exactly what this is. But it was a fun little experience. I'm definitely trying out more photo bashing, you know, as I go, but this wasn't super successful. But it did inspire me to, you know, like change the design of this, and I put a little bit more design over here because when I was painting over I realized this didn't look very good, and I didn't like, you know, when I was photo bashing into this area, I didn't really like how this leg section looked, so I redesigned that, etc, etc. Pretty much just trying to work into it and like try and improve it. Another very like small subtle thing here is just adding in this other red stripe over here on the pipe. Doing stuff like this, like if you have like a primary color, you know, which is quite dominant in the scene, you don't want it to just be in one area. You want it to interact with like other sections of the image, because that makes it feel more like there is a color palette. Sometimes I feel like if you only have one thing in the scene that is red, for example, it will look very, very out of place, you know. So if I was doing like a forest scene and this was all green and there was this big red robot in it, maybe I put some pink flowers on the ground or orange flowers on the ground as like another introduction of that warmer color set, so that this feels more integrated into its environment. So it's the same thing with, you know, just putting this red stripe on the pipe. It just helps this robot feel more integrated. Then as we go through, you can see I'm starting to come in, so I'm editing my lighting a bit. I moved the leg around slightly. I felt that these two, the arm and the leg, were a little bit too in parallel, so I moved the leg more towards camera. I'm adding, you know, kind of like a bit of dust in the background here to pull out this character because he's very hidden. I've put some light on top of him over here. I've also gone in and started texturing stuff. So not all of my texturing happens in 3D. So all of these like leaky pipe things are just photo textures that I've put in on overlay mode, similar to the kind of brush thing that I was showing earlier, just to help make this look a little bit more grimy and crappy. The same with, these areas down here. This is just also photo textures put in. Same with the effects on the armor. That's photo textures. The same up here. This is just brush textures that I've brushed in very hastily. But doing all of this stuff and building it up over time is what will give it kind of like a realistic sense of grime and dirt. And what we've done here, we've changed the helmet design a little bit. We've added some more wires up here, added that glow into the middle. I think this kind of helps a lot, or a lot of changes here, but I think adding that glow into the middle helps quite a lot because it adds a little bit more story in there. We've obviously got this really big cable that's kind of like running out of the robot. And I think at that point you can kind of decide for yourself, like, okay, maybe they're siphoning power from the robot, maybe they're charging it up, who knows? But the second you have that kind of element coming in, specifically this big snaking wire and the light, it really helps to sell a sense of story. You can see here I've done some custom graffiti on the walls, anywhere underground and, not kept. Maybe someone's come in with some graffiti and done some stuff on the side. I've got some kind of like old like ship making marks on the wall here, just kind of like the graphic design look of all of this. Got some warning stripes. I've also added in some more, you can see between here and, where did I add that stuff in? Maybe like here. I've added in some more details there. That's photo bashing details. But essentially just like started to pop this out. I've added in even some little bits of sand, sticking out of the corners and the edges of the gaps of stuff, right? Yeah, I don't know if there's anything like super else to say about that. And then as we go, it's just a case of adding more and more and more details in pretty much until we get right to the end. So, between here and here, I'd say there's actually quite a lot of work going on, right? Especially if you look at, this chest area even. I've painted in some cut marks. I've added in some other markings, putting in little details like stars on the chest, maybe this is a robot that got like 2 kills and they were like marking it, with stars for every kill it got. Having, like little markings, like chalk markings on the pipe for whoever, I guess, is in charge of maintaining these things. Maybe that means, hey, don't touch that bit, whatever. But I'm just trying to add in a lot of like small, subtle storytelling things, as well as ensuring that, again, your eye is being drawn towards the focal point. So obviously, as I was saying with the city design, I'm trying to ensure that there is a greater level of detail usually around this central area. Here, the main thing that's drawing you in is the massive density of this kind of like color, right? This like bright red color, which draws your eye in, but also the contrasting blue that helps you kind of like move into this central area, because it's not, again, I've added the blue into other areas here, here, and here, over here on this wall, but this is where it's the most bright and the most prominent, so you naturally kind of look there. And then again, because we're humans, we love to see other humans looking at things, so popping out this character again with a little bit more rim light so that he looks a little bit more visible, but also having him kind of like directly looking at the robot really helps draw our attention there, because naturally when we see kind of like people in scenes looking at stuff, we want to follow their direction and also look at it. I'm just gonna take a quick drink of water. Cool. So onto the kind of penultimate image of this one. This is this giant turret. I had a sketch for this, but I have no idea where it is, sadly. It's just disappeared into the ether. But this one started off very finished. So sometimes, with the ideas that we produce, it just so happens that things work out. This one did have a much rougher stage, which I've lost the file of. But essentially, this one was probably the fastest of all the images that I did. With an image like this, the reason I like doing something like this is because it's got a very clear graphic read, right? It's like a big object against a bigger landscape almost, this like kind of like dusty gray background. And we can just start adding stuff in that guides us towards it. One thing you might notice is these little like robot guys. So the idea was, I'm not sure how well it translated, but the idea was that these are like also dead robots that are left over from whatever left this whole kind of like place of wasteland. And you can kind of see there's some of them in the background, back here and back here. One of my friends said he thought they were very badly painted skeletons. So maybe I need to make it more clear next time that they are robots. But the general idea is like these robots have been left here for like, 200 years or something, and all of this stuff is just remnants of like some past bigger empire. And you can see I'm also like reusing some stuff. So these kind of like energy cells in the back here are the where are they here? There we go. They're over here in this scene. And you know, we have like, I've used like this little kind of like ventilation unit kit bash thing that I have. Don't know what project that's from, but I've got it from somewhere, and that is also like down there on the ground on this building to add in some like random detail into there. So once I start a project, I really don't mind reusing stuff as I go, because ultimately, you know, if I've used it in one image, it's probably going to fit into another one if it's all meant to be in the same world. These just one last example of this, but these kind of like red elements, this is the same red element that we have. Literally, where is it? It's definitely in this image now, but I'm blanking on where I put it. Oh, there. That's the same element there. And it's also the same element I have there in this one, which we will get to. But yeah, this image started off very finished. I just essentially designed like a big shape, which I thought would be a cool, big, iconic shape. And then I just started detailing into it. So really, this is a matter of, you know, just going in and selecting areas, booleaning maybe a little bit of it out, decreasing the size, putting some stuff into the gap where I've you know, removed things. It's a very additive, subtractive and additive process when I'm designing something like this. So really what I'm looking for is I'm trying to create spaces where you can go inside the machinery and spaces where you are outside of the machinery, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to give like different levels of depth into the machine. Someone who does this super well, and I'm a massive fan of his work, is Sparth. If you go look at his spaceship designs, he often has like these interior areas where you can like see through the ship almost. And I always think it makes it just look super cool and like way more engaging. So it's something I try and do in my work as well. You know, in terms of like other world building stuff, I've got these like blast shields at the front, you know, in case like you know, maybe a shell goes like and like hits this so it doesn't hit the bottom of the turret. You know, maybe this is much bigger underneath the sand. You can kind of imagine this sand is like piled up and it's kind of like dug inside this machinery, right? So maybe this could be like 30 feet tall underneath the sand. I have no idea. And I've also got some of these shell casings. I just thought this would be like an interesting thing to really sell the idea of this being a big gun, is like having some shell casings that have been abandoned on the ground. And also a nice way to introduce like another color in there. So just a little bit of blue to add a bit of difference. I haven't said it, but all of this is modeled in Blender, by the way. I'm not really doing anything else. I think the only thing that might be different is some of these wires might be done from Gravity Sketch, but I can't quite remember. But anyway, with this one, really, this is very straightforward. So as you can see, I'm just going in. The first thing was doing some texturing. Some of these textures are actually from Blender, so there are some very good sci-fi paneling packs you can buy. So these are just PBR paneling textures that I've put on generated and box mode, so that they wrap around the form, and I've just painted them in and out depending on where I think they look good. So I haven't put them literally everywhere, because sometimes you get like really weird shapes and stuff, but you know, here it looks pretty cool, here it looks pretty cool, so it's all in there. I've also gone in and photo bashed in some textures, so all of this grime on there. You can see like how immediately more realistic that shield wall looks the second you put those textures on. Before, it's just this like blank single shade thing. Afterwards, it's this like highly, I wouldn't say it's highly realistic, but it looks far more realistic. And I've also started putting in some little dust clouds and stuff as I go, and I've spent some time making a nice background with some kind of like high resolution desert cloud imagery. And then, you know, like I said, this one is pretty straightforward. So from there to there, I've gone in, I've put in some like bullet holes on here. So, you know, you can imagine a slug went through it. I found these really cool photos of World War II tanks that had been hit with bullets, like anti-armor bullets. And it's just like the melted gooiness of the texture was so cool. And I've also added that in here. I was kind of thinking these little panel things were maybe like heat tiles or something. So maybe if like small arms fire comes in, this absorbs some of the heat, you know, and kind of like bounces off it. I've also, as I usually do, I've added in some decals and some more textures everywhere. I've put in, you know, some textures even underneath these panels. And yeah, I'm just trying to like generally build it up. And like I said, this one's very straightforward compared to some of the others. That's the GUI thing that I was saying, the bullet hole. But yeah, that's pretty much where this one is. So this to this, essentially. So this one, very, very straightforward because of the nature of the work. You know, it's a much simpler image, I think, than the others in some ways, and naturally kind of more effective. Obviously, as with every image you do, there's always things you could change and do better, but I was pretty happy with this one. Which brings us to this one, which is the last part of this project. So I would say definitely by the time I was doing this one, I was like, oh man, I got to get this project over with. But this was pretty fun as well. I think this one, as with many of the others, it starts with a little bit of 3D and a sketch. You can definitely see a process. When I'm working on a project, I generally will just do like, I will use the same process over and over again for most of the images, because if I don't do that, I start to see differing results. So as with the others, this starts with a bit of 3D and a sketch. And the idea was I wanted to do like an abandoned communication tower. So here is this ginormous tower stuck in the desert in the middle of nowhere. And again, you know, from here to here is a fairly straightforward process. It's really just about taking all of these pieces and going in and like, I guess making sure that everything feels like it has the appropriate amount of detail. Interestingly, I don't think this does have the appropriate amount of detail. And if we go through, you can see kind of how I built it up a little bit. So that's one render. That's a render with like a volume on top. Here is a bit of photo bashing, or maybe this was a render as well. I'm not 100% sure. This is definitely 3D. This is all 3D, I think. Oh no, maybe that's photo bash. See, sometimes I can't remember. That's definitely photo bash here. These like smaller textural details. That's quite hard to get in 3D, I find. And then here, you know, obviously adding in all of this stuff is 3D as well. But even with all of this stuff, I wasn't feeling that it was super convincing. And I think with something of this scale, you know, if you imagine that a person is just gonna be like a dot compared to a tower this big, right? So I think the immediate thing to do, and this is what I did, was just go in and do way more detailing. So you can see here quite a fairly big change. Haven't drastically changed the structure of the image or anything, but you know, one of my friends suggested adding in more of these kind of like communication tower thingamabobs. I don't know what you'd call them, like I don't know, radar panels or something. That's maybe the intention of them. It's sci-fi, it doesn't have to make sense, right? I've gone in and I've put in a lot more kind of like detail in these areas over here a little bit, you know, so like adding in this kind of like ridging across this area definitely helps. Adding in quite a lot more detail on the tower, right? So like making even these communication dishes, I've gone in and like modeled quite a lot more on those just to make them actually look a little bit more interesting. I've also scaled them up somewhat. I do generally find if you're going to put in an element, you may as well make it almost like as big as you can to make it stand out. And then I've kept some of the photo bashing from before because I just kind of like carried it over from the other image. And I've started putting in wires and piping and, you know, like much more clear textural elements on the actual tower itself, etc., etc. I'm also using at this stage, just because I felt it really helped, some more complicated PBRs. So the stuff here on the top is not 2D work. This is not photo bash like in the other ones. This is actually 3D. So there are these really wonderful kind of like PBR node groups you can buy online, which will give you like, you know, dirt and textural placement and stuff. So if you go on ArtStation, you type in like, you know, spaceship panel dirt or something, you'll probably find something very similar to this. But that really helped do a lot of work for me very quickly, because the second you add in all of that kind of like dirt and grime, it really helps push the realism of an image. I also kind of like, so this was an area that I photo bashed. I remodeled that area into something a lot nicer, which I think was good. And then, you know, there's a few other things like adding another pipe down here and changing the value structure a tiny bit and blah, blah, blah. And then again, essentially from here, it's all very similar to the other ones, adding in more photo bash, changing the color palette slightly, adding in some effects, you know, whatever. I think maybe with this one, I kind of like put it into, I kind of made it a little bit too bluey gray compared to the others. Maybe I should have retained a little bit more of the red, but hey, there you go. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, this whole project really is very simplistic. I would say that this is the process I use on like 99% of my projects, 99% of the work. I will start off with sketches, I'll do a bit of 3D, I'll do some blockouts, I'll sketch over 3D, and I go back and forth and try and figure out what I want. It's quite a chaotic process, but it is a process that works for me. And I'll hopefully show some other projects in the future which have like different approaches and different ways of working. But this is essentially how I went about doing this. So if you've enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments. If you have any other projects of mine that you would like me to explain or talk about, then please let me know, because that will give me kind of like a impetus to go and do those ones. But otherwise, yeah, I hope this has been useful. Obviously, the whole point of this is to help demystify the process a little bit. I know it's not a traditional tutorial like a lot of people do, but this is, I hope, something that gives you an insight into, the more realistic processes maybe that people use sometimes, especially in personal work, which can be a lot more chaotic and weird than actually doing industry work. So yeah, I hope this was fun, and thank you for giving it a listen. I will see you next time. Cheers.